For more debates, updates, and bonus content, sign up at thebigconversation.show. You didn't grow up in a particularly Christian or church-going household, did you? So what were your sort of formative experiences of Christianity as you grew into adulthood?
Well, I grew up in the 70s and the 80s as a child and a teenager. So back then, I suppose Christianity was all around, actually. It was all around, but it wasn't particularly active. Not in my life, anyway. I mean, my parents were not Christian. They weren't religious at all. My dad was quite strongly atheist, but not in a particularly committed way. He just thought it was all nonsense, so he didn't think about it much. My mum is a spiritual being, actually, but not a Christian one. So we just weren't a religious household at all, and so I didn't think about it either. But these were the days, and I don't know, maybe they still are in schools, where the assemblies were religious, and you had your RE lessons, and I went to the Cub and the Scout troop, and that was a Baptist church troop, and so Christianity was, I grew up with it. I memorized the Lord's Prayer at school, and I was in the nativity plays, and I knew the gospel stories, or some of them, because we would have to listen to them, and I wasn't very enthusiastic about them. But I think there was I felt this in England for a long time. There was just a sense of sort of slight irrelevance about it all, actually, certainly for me. And I think that it felt like a hang up from a time that it was real, but we didn't believe it anymore. At least those were the stories that the culture told us, and they still are, really, that this is a sort of a bit of superstition that we'd be better off without, but in a very English way. I've always felt that the English are not particularly anti-religious. They're just sort of not religious in a kind of polite, quiet fashion. We just sort of ignore that. Certainly we did then. So that was the background, really.
You did have a bit of sort of teenage sort of rebellion. In your article, you talk about defacing the visitors' book of a church and that sort of thing. I'm ashamed to admit this in front of the former Archbishop. I apologise officially. We were really just mucking around. It wasn't an anti-religious rebellion. It was just the sort of stupid thing that teenage boys do. But yes, it sort of went. I suppose it went hand in hand with the sort of back then. Certainly, if you wanted to be a teenage rebel, and I wasn't a particularly rebellious teenager, but intellectually the thing to do was to be an atheist and to say that it was all nonsense, of course, because you imagined that you were sticking it to the man. You were rebelling against the adults, even though none of the adults in my life were interested in Christianity at all. But there was a sense that this was still the hang up of the stale old culture, and so you had to make it clear that you were moving on to something. But it's funny, because even though I was sort of doing all that in a half-hearted way, as I say, I wasn't very committed to it, and I wasn't. I might have sort of mocked Christianity or not had much interest in it, but I wasn't ever really much of an atheist. I mean, I did go through a sort of period of a couple of years of trying to be a sort of teenage Richard Dawkins, but it was never very convincing. I didn't really believe it, because at the same time as I was mocking religion, I was a real lover of fantasy literature and a great believer in ghosts and the supernatural and fairies and all of the other sort of almost more, maybe less institutional ways to connect with the divine, actually, funnily enough. So there was a sense that religion was a kind of strange waste of time, or even something dangerous. But I was never one of these people who thought the world was disenchanted, really. I always knew it was enchanted, but I didn't know what to do with that. So tell us a little bit about how your journey carried on, because obviously you got very involved in the environmental movement, in activism around that. And I suppose you were looking for something that connected with that sort of belief in the kind of the sacredness of Mother Earth and so on. Tell us about sort of some of the ways in which that manifested in your sort of spiritual journey alongside your environmental activism. Well,
again, when I look back now, from this vantage point, I look back on my whole life as a kind of fumbling spiritual quest, which I didn't necessarily see it as being at the time. And the environmental activism that I got involved in was secondary to the sense of the sense of the sacredness of nature that I had. That was where it came from. It wasn't the activism, yes, it was political and economic, and but that was almost a rationalist expression of having experienced something, I think, divine in nature. I used to go on a lot of walks with my dad when I was young. He was a great long distance walker, and we spent weeks walking and camping in wild places. And I think he accidentally made me a pantheist. You know, I don't think that was his intention, but I had very Wordsworthian experiences in the mountains. Just nothing spectacular, but just an endless sense of the living power of the natural world. This is not just a material resource. And so when you have that relationship, which I now think is a relationship to the sacred, the relationship to God actually expressed through creation, if you want to put it in Christian terms. And then you come back and you see that the society that you're in is systematically destroying all of it in order to turn it into money, effectively. Then that's certainly my case. That made me an activist, and that was true of a lot of other green people that I knew. There's a sense, actually, that something very sacrilegious is happening. Down below all of the conversations about climate change and carbon and all of this kind of rational level stuff, there's a sense that something really sacrilegious is being done to the living world of which you're a part. And so that was my motivation, even though I wouldn't necessarily have used words like that. But now that I look back on it, I could see that was what was going on.
So this sort of led you obviously to the activism side. You were also still looking for, I suppose, that spiritual thread as you went through your life, and this took you in lots of different directions. Zen Buddhism, Wicca. Tell us about the Wicca phase, because that's quite interesting. You sort of, for those who aren't familiar with it, they may just think witchcraft. It's a relatively recent sort of thought system, though, isn't it? As you say.
Yes. Well, it's sort of it's a very post 1968 slightly made up religion, basically, along with a lot of other sort of New Age-ish things. Wiccans would get very cross if you called them New Age, but they basically are. I mean, it's interesting because what happened to me was in my 30s, I suppose. I sort of formalized this spiritual quest, and I thought, okay, this is where I am. I need to find out what the truth is. And I spent a long time practicing Buddhism, and Buddhism's I was a Chan Zen Buddhist in a slightly, I wasn't hugely committed to it, but I spent a lot of time on retreats and a lot of practice, and it's a very, very valuable tradition. It teaches you a lot about the self, particularly, actually. But I realized uncomfortably towards the end of that period of 5 or 6 years or so that I wanted to worship. Actually, I was looking for God, and I didn't really want to hear that, but that was what was going on. And you don't get that in Buddhism, actually, and you certainly don't get a response to the kind of call that I thought I was feeling, even though I didn't want to feel it. And because I was a lover of nature, I thought, well, okay, I'm feeling quite religious here. There's a deity involved. There's a God involved in this, and I like nature, so I'll find a nature religion. So that was really what I did. And I went looking for sort of nature religions, and I looked into druidry and things. And I ended up practicing Wicca. Ended up in a coven, a local coven of witches. And what Wicca is it's a kind of, as I say, it's a mashup of all sorts of different things, notions, slightly made up notions of rediscovered ancient goddess worship, and some Western mystery traditions, a little bit of Aleister Crowley in there, lots of slightly mystical Kabbalah, a bit of Buddhism. I mean, you kind of mix it all in and stir it around, and then you invent some gods, and then you're sort of there. And the whole thing is sort of an excuse to worship nature in the woods. But it was something which at one level was quite satisfying, because it satisfied my need to find find a name for the divine. That's what I was trying to do. I was trying to find God, or rather God was trying to find me. And I was stumbling around, and obviously not thinking that I would ever look at something like Christianity, because you don't do that. And so, yeah, I ended up there, and until I got sort of pulled out of it, really.
Well, tell us about that, and we'll then come to Rowan for some of his reflections on your story. Because in a way, going from Wicca to Christianity, sounds quite dramatic. And in a way, there was a sort of one or two penny dropping moments, I think, along the way where you yourself were surprised at this journey you were going on.
Well, again, I think now when I look back at Wicca, I see Wicca as a Christian heresy, actually, weirdly enough. And I see a lot of New Age stuff as a bit of a Christian heresy, because it's firstly, I mean, in terms of the way that Wiccans actually do their ceremonies, there's a lot of playing around with bread and wine and altars and all sorts of things like that. And they would be very cross if you told them that they were satirizing Christianity, but they are. And there is a sense that a lot of these New Age religions have behind them broadly Christian values, actually, but they don't want to deal with Christ, and they don't want to deal with monotheism, and they don't want to deal with the church. A lot of it actually is a rebellion against institutions.
which I think is a much broader cultural issue that's going on at the moment. They just don't like hierarchy. They don't like priests. They don't like institutions. They don't like books with rules in. So it's very much a very contemporary, very post-war Western rebellion against forms, I think. And I wasn't so interested in that myself. I was looking for God, and I just started having very strange experiences. Which these things are difficult to describe, but I was having dreams and I was having experiences, and I was meeting Christians every 5 minutes. I was getting emails from Christians. I used to run a writing school, and I endlessly suddenly had vicars writing to me and asking me to read their sermons and give them feedback. And I had people I'd known for years suddenly tell me they were Christian and I hadn't known. And I felt like, really, I felt after I'd read some C.S. Lewis, I kind of recognized what was going on, because I felt like I was just being hunted, actually. I thought, oh God, I'm being hunted by Jesus. I can't deal with this. This was not the plan. But it was happening. It's if I'd listened to this sort of thing 5 years ago, I thought it sounded absurd. But it happened to me, and I felt like I was physically dragged out of Wicca, actually. I felt like I was physically being told, you've got to get out of here because this is not good stuff you're doing. And it isn't good stuff, actually. There's all sorts of strange forces at work that people are not necessarily aware of, I think, now. And I really felt like I had really been looking for God, and God had come to find me, or Christ had come to find me particularly. And one of the reasons I thought that this was true, apart from the fact that it wouldn't stop, was that I didn't want it to be true. Interestingly, I'd gone looking for Buddhism and I'd gone looking for Wicca because I thought they fitted with how I saw the world, but I didn't think Christianity fitted with how I saw the world at all, and I didn't want to be Christian. And eventually I just basically had to accept that this was happening and give into it and see where it took me, because I'd asked for it, so now I had to deal with the consequences.
And your wife had, in a sort of funny way, prophesied it, I think, over a meal or something. You tell this story that she said,
she did, actually.
You're going to become a Christian.
My wife comes from a Sikh background, and she's rediscovering her Sikhism as we kind of grow together. And it's interesting, actually. She's very good at quietly prophesizing things. She's much more spiritually intelligent than me. And one day we were just out for dinner a couple of years before any of this happened, and she suddenly said, apropos of nothing, she said, "You're going to become a Christian." And we weren't even talking about religion. I said, "What are you talking about?" And she said, "I don't know. I just knew that. So I had to say it." And she was right, as she usually is. And a lot of things like that happened. A lot of very strange prophetic things that you don't believe about. You don't believe until they happen. So, and then since I was asked to write a piece about it, I wrote the piece you talked about. And since then, I've inevitably had a lot of emails from people who've said something really similar happened to me. So it's surprising, maybe not to you, but it was surprising to me how common this kind of experience is.